Chapter 1. The Sentence He Never Finished. He said my edits killed his genius. Then he stole the story we built together and vanished with the only copy. A year later, I stood under the lights of the New York Public Library reading from my own book, the one he claimed was his. When he stepped out of the crowd and accused me cameras rolling, I looked him in the eye and said, "No, I finished it. You just walked away." I'm Adrian Hale, the editor who turned Betrayal into a bestseller, and this is the story he never finished. Rain hammered the bay windows like a restless drummer, and the lamplight in our Wicker Park apartment turned the steam from my mug into a small weather system. I had the last chapter open on my laptop. I had highlighted a paragraph that refused to behave. The character walked out of a hospital room laughing after a confession scene that should have left him shaken. He could not laugh there. Not if we wanted the ending to land. I said this without looking up. My voice already knew the grooves of the argument. Across the table, Lucas Merritt set his elbows on a stack of marked pages. He was 38 and carried himself like the lead at a book festival panel. His hair had a practiced looseness, the kind that suggested careless genius. He tapped a pen against his palm and said that the laugh was intentional. I told him again that it betrayed the emotional logic we had built for 280 pages. I reminded him of the promise we made to keep truth louder than theatrics. He smiled in that careful way that belonged on dust jackets. He told me I edit everyone. Then he added that I even edit him. I tried to breathe past the bruise those words found. Harbour and Quill counted on me to be a clean scalpel. I had done that job for years. I had rescued clumsy manuscripts from implosion and helped first-time authors find endings they did not know they were capable of writing. Lucas knew that about me when we started dating. He liked to say I kept his chaos elegant. He meant it as a compliment until tonight. I slid the laptop toward him and pointed to the margin notes. I had left timestamps on our changes to keep the conversation honest. We had been working on this manuscript since the spring of 2019. We named it As the Words Fade on a Walk by the Lake when wind cuffed our faces and the gulls sounded like rusty hinges. The timeline was taped to our refrigerator, chapters cresting into winter, draft deadlines that marched toward a late 2022 release. I told him again that our final chapter needed one moment of stillness, a grief that did not perform, a quiet that allowed the reader to complete the sentence with their own breath. He said we were overthinking it. He said readers loved the way he undercut sadness with humor. I said this was not humor. This was an exit from accountability. The kettle ticked on the stove behind me, and the apartment smelled like wet sidewalk and rosemary from the plant in the windowsill that never thrived but refused to die. Lucas stood restless and paced to the bookshelf. He ran a finger along spines we had alphabetized on a rainy Saturday in our first month here. He lifted a novella by a writer we both adored and said that writer broke rules all the time. I told him breaking rules without earning it was not rebellion. It was laziness wearing a leather jacket. He laughed without warmth and said maybe the problem was that I did not know when to stop fixing things. He said my job trained me to keep cutting until nothing bled. The pen tapped faster against his palm. I watched his eyes skim the room as if searching for a version of us that would let him win without moving a single comma. He came back to the table and leaned over the laptop. He read my note out loud in a measured tone. He said it sounded like a verdict. I told him it was a diagnosis, not a sentence. I said our character did not get to joke his way out of the wound he created. Lucas looked at me then with a tired kind of defiance and said maybe he did. Maybe he laughed because that was how some men handled shame. I told him we were not documenting his defense mechanisms. We were writing an ending that had to respect the reader. The rain grew heavier, and the alley below filled with the metallic wash of a passing bus. I felt the tightness climb my throat. We had not been sleeping, we had not been touching. We had been living draft to draft and calling it intimacy. I wanted to step out of my editor self and reach for his wrist and say we were scared because we were approaching something final. I wanted to ask if he was afraid this book would tether us together in a way that marriage had not. He had proposed in a gentle half-sentence in July, and then retracted it with silence. It had become a habit between us, speaking in fragments and then letting the pause carry the weight. He said, "This is not a workshop, Adrian." He used my name like a gavel. He said, "This is my voice." I said, "This is our book." He said the book would be better if I trusted his instincts. I said I had been trusting them for 3 years, and tonight they were asking for an ending that lied. He looked at the screen again. He read the last paragraph and the laugh that disrupted it. He shook his head a little, an actor rejecting direction, and then turned to the sideboard where his leather bag waited. He unzipped it with a motion so practiced it sounded like a line break. He reached into the drawer beneath the table where we kept spare hard drives and cords. He took the slim silver USB drive we both used as insurance and held it up like a found key. My heart thumped once in my throat. Do not. I said it low. He was already pushing the drive into the side of his laptop. His face was a calm mask that meant he had decided the argument needed spectacle. He clicked with economical certainty through folders labeled Drafts New Drafts Finals and then the date-stamped directory from last week. He told me he was copying the most recent version. I moved around the table and put my hand on the lid of his computer. He did not look at me. He said we had agreed to back up everything. I said we had agreed to back up the book we were both writing. He said that was exactly what he was doing. He dragged the file into the removable drive. The progress bar made a small, polite march. He ejected the drive with a soft digital chime and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with the kind of stillness that always precedes a cruel act, he opened our shared drive and selected the project folder. He right-clicked. He hovered over delete. He told me this is mine to finish. I felt my hand find the edge of the table. I said his name and then said please. He pressed delete. A prompt asked if he was sure. He clicked yes. The screen blinked and the folder evaporated with a small animation that felt obscene. He did not flinch. He snapped the laptop shut and the sound made the rosemary leaves tremble. Maybe we are just... He started to say something then and let the rest dissolve like sugar in black coffee. He reached for his coat from the back of the chair. He slipped his arms into it with the grace of someone walking onto a stage. He lifted his bag, checked the pocket where the silver USB now lived, and moved toward the door. I followed him into the short hall. The floorboards complained under our weight. I could smell the damp wool of his coat and the detergent we both used because it made our clothes smell like a rented cabin after rain. I said we can sit, we can take an hour, we can print the chapter and draw the beats and name where it breaks. He shook his head without malice. He said I would only keep cutting. He said he needed to write without hearing my pencil. He put his hand on the doorknob and paused, as if remembering the choreography of leaving with dignity. He failed to find it. He opened the door and the winter air shouldered itself into our home. Then he stepped out and the door shut with a sound that found my bones. I stood there for a long count. The radiator hissed behind me like a scolded cat. The clock over the stove clicked once. The apartment felt suddenly museum quiet like a set after the audience had gone home. I moved back to the table and opened my laptop, and the empty space where our folder had lived beamed at me with the awful good manners of a cleared plate. A slick panic tried to rise. I told it no. I went to the email client and searched for attachments I had sent to myself on nights when I did not trust our systems. I found fragments, scenes, an outline that still smelled like spring. They were not the current chapter, but they were enough to prove I had not imagined our work. I downloaded them with a care that felt like tending a wound. I sent a message to my managing editor at Harbor and Quill that I would be late on the blurb I had promised for a debut essay collection. I did not explain. She would not ask for details. She would sense the shape of what had happened the way editors sense storm pressure. I closed the email and stared at the last line he had left unguarded earlier on the page. Love is what stays when words fail. I had written that in a moment that felt generous. Now it felt like a dare. I walked to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists until my pulse backed away from my skin. The window over the sink fogged and my reflection blurred into a soft, faceless figure. I thought of the first time we met of an author party in River North where he had mocked a pretentious panel with a joke so precise I spilled my drink in laughter. I thought of the early drafts when we believed collaboration meant being half of a two-headed animal that could see in every direction. I thought of the first small lie the book required, the one where we pretended we had the same ending in mind. Lies were efficient like that. They scaled. I returned to the table. The rosemary leaned toward the glass as if chasing an older son. I pulled the charger free from the outlet so the cord would not snake across my knees while I wrote. I opened a new document. I watched the cursor blink. I realized I wanted to put something on the page that no one could take by dragging it to a trash icon. I needed to make the first decision that belonged only to me. I began to type without ceremony. I did not write about him. I wrote about the room after him, the air that still held his cologne in the corners, the chair back with the ghost of his shoulder, the cup ring that would bleach into the wood by morning. I wrote the noises I could hear through the storm. A woman on the floor above me moving furniture in slow increments, a car splashing through the intersection like a wave turning over. I described the way endings arrive in ordinary clothes, the way they knock without fists, the way they can look like a man retrieving a flash drive and choosing to be unaccountable. I stopped. I saved what I had with a name that felt true. I typed the file name with careful hands, unfinished. It sat there on my desktop, small and stubborn, a seed and a signpost. I closed the laptop. I turned off the lamp and the room surrendered to the color of the storm. I put his spare keys in the bowl by the door because I did not want to see them on the table when I woke. I folded the blanket on the couch even though I knew I would not sleep there. I set my phone face down and turned off every alert that would tempt me to chase his shadow across the night. The radiator sighed again. The building settled like an old ship finding its balance. I stood by the window and watched the orange wash of the streetlight pulse through the rain. I let my shoulders drop. I let the sentence he had abandoned run out of ink. Maybe we are just... The word just floated in the air and then thinned until I could not hear it anymore. I went to bed without checking the hallway for his footsteps. I did not rehearse speeches I would never give. I did not bargain with a memory. I lay there listening to the rain do the talking and felt something unclench in the space that language usually occupies. It was not resolution. It was not even peace. It was the simple relief of a choice made. I would not wait for him to return the story he had decided to steal. I would write something he could not finish for me. When I woke, the apartment smelled like coffee I had not yet brewed. The light was pewter. The street below wore the damp like a second skin. I opened the laptop and clicked once on the small icon that said what it needed to say, unfinished. Then I opened a blank page beside it and the day made room. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 2. The Words He Stole. Commuter lights slid across my desk in thin rectangles and the office hum at Harbor and Quill rose and fell like a tide. The blank page sat patient on the right side of my screen, a new room with fresh paint, and my inbox stacked itself into predictable towers. By mid-morning, I had read 2 proposals and ghosted 3 meetings by moving them into the late afternoon where time goes to nap. I kept waiting for the ache from last winter to flare that old meteor in my ribs, but the ache stayed quiet. Work makes its own anesthesia. Margaret Shaw paused at my doorway with a paper cup and a look that has held a dozen authors together with spit and patience. She is 55 and has the gait of a former runner who now carries a newsroom on her shoulders. She asked how I was sleeping, and I told her better than the stock market. She tilted her head in that way that says she hears the lie and decides to be kind anyway. She said it might be time to write the thing only I can write. She said the scalpel can point away from other people's pages for a while. I told her I had a new folder called Unfinished and that the name felt like a dare. She smiled and said unfinished is just a first draft's costume. By noon, the office smelled like burnt espresso and printer heat. I walked with Lena Park down to a spot on Wabash that thinks it is a New York cafe in a Chicago body. The clerk knows Lena by her tote bag and me by my refusal to try their seasonal syrups. We carried lattes to the window and watched a man argue with his umbrella while the wind practiced being November and June. Lena slid a thin magazine across the table. She did not speak at first. The cover showed Lucas in a charcoal coat, his chin angled like a compass needle, the headline printed in clean serif. The story began as mine alone. My fingers did that small tremor they do when a nerve is pressed without warning. Lena told me she had not bought it to be cruel. She said she would burn it if I wanted. I told her to leave arson for bigger sins. I opened to the spread where his black and white author photo tried to look like empathy. I could hear his cadence in the line breaks. He talked about the risk of letting laughter into grief. He talked about a voice that arrives fully formed if you work hard enough to deserve it. He talked about the relief of knowing when to stop listening to other people. It would have washed over me like any advertisement if not for the pull quote under his name. The sentence read, "The story began as mine alone," and the italics reached into the muscle memory of my fingers. I had typed a version of that sentence in an email last fall, not as a boast, but as a warning to us both. I had written the story will end as ours if we let it. I was not prepared to see only the first half of that thought wearing evening clothes. Lena said my face had gone that quiet white it gets when I am either about to cry or about to fix something broken. I told her I was fine. I told her the past belongs to itself and the future is a better tenant. She let the lie pass again the way friends do when dignity is trying to stand on wet rocks. Back at my desk, I pulled up the archive of drafts I had salvaged after that winter night. The files lived in a folder that I named for a city we never visited. I opened a version from July of the previous year and began to read with a detective's eyes. It started as a game, circle a phrase and find it in the interview. It stopped being a game when I found an odd little comma I always place before the last item in a list, the quirk that copy editors email me about with tender exasperation. There it was in his new book sample pages, too. I searched again and found a simile so specific I could feel the chair I had been sitting in when I wrote it. A bus sounded like a wave turning over. He had laughed at that line the first night I tried it, said the image worked harder than the bus did. He had kept it apparently without the laugh. There is a point when disbelief becomes a logistics problem. I printed 3 pages from the old draft and 3 pages from the interview and laid them side by side on the rug. The sentences hummed at the same pitch. Not plagiarized line to line, not enough for a courtroom's appetite, but close enough to ask a different question. What part of this voice belongs to him and what part has my hands in it? That question hurt less than I expected. It felt like the right puzzle for the day. I sent a short email to Lucas. It was a polite note with the heat turned way down. I told him I had read the interview. I told him a line appeared that matched a note I had written to him. I asked how he wanted to handle future credits and promotional materials. I said it would be useful to acknowledge shared development on an early iteration. I attached the old draft. I did not mention the night with the drive. I did not mention the folder that winked out. I pressed send and watched the message leave like a brave animal stepping into traffic. An hour passed. The afternoon tried to sag, but emails kept me vertical. 2 hours. A meeting about cover art that leaned toward moody blues. 3 hours. Lena sent a string of yellow hearts, and I pretended I did not understand their language. At 4:30, I accepted his silence and let it say what it needed to say. It said the story began as mine alone because I have decided to erase your shadow. Walking home along this river, I practiced not being outraged. Outrage burns clean for 5 minutes and then leaves soot on the walls you still have to live with. I decided on a different solvent. If he wanted to insist on a singular origin, I would insist on my own present tense. The next morning, I called Oliver Stokes. He is a lawyer who prefers bicycle commutes and pebbled ice. He once taught me how to write a termination clause that did not sound like a threat. He met me in a booth at a diner where the napkins are optimistic about gravy. He listened without interrupting. He slid my printed pages back and forth. He asked simple questions about dates and who saved what and when. He did not sigh at the mess. He drew a rectangle on a legal pad to represent the zone where litigation lives and wrote very likely at the top edge. He said we can make a strong claim on contribution and development if you want to do this. He said the interview line raises eyebrows and the stylistic fingerprints help. He said depositions could make him uncomfortable and uncomfortable men settle. He said we could also start small with a letter to his publisher and request an acknowledgement page revision on reprints. He said a public correction feels better than a private check for a lot of people, and sometimes a small correction does more visible work than a lawsuit. I stirred my coffee and watched the cream make galaxies I could not live in. I asked him how much of my next year he thought this would cost. He said the process eats mornings first and then afternoons. He said the best cases end before they truly begin, but most of them track mud across your good rug. He looked at me with the kind of care old friends reserve for days when courage misbehaves. He told me I could win if winning meant a settlement and a paragraph in a paperback. He asked what I wanted winning to mean. I told him I wanted to stop being an audience to someone else's explanation of my work. I said I wanted my future tense to be louder than my past tense. He nodded and put his pen away. He said he would be ready if I changed my mind. He said a letter could sit in a drafts folder until I needed it. He paid the bill over my protest because he knows how stubborn I am about fairness in small things when I refuse it in large ones. That afternoon, the office felt bright and tinny. The air conditioner made a soft hiss like secrets being told to a wall. Margaret stopped by again and asked if I had read anything good. I told her I had read a headline that proved I am not the only person who can carry my voice home. She understood too quickly and told me I could take the rest of the week to write. She said the schedules would bend. She said real work deserves daylight. On my way out, Lena caught my sleeve. She asked if I wanted to visit the bookshop on State where they put author interviews near the register. She said she had a theory about seeing a wound in public that makes it smaller. I told her I would pass. I told her I was going to make something that could not be shelved next to him. She kissed the air near my temple and told me to text her a picture of the first page. The apartment let me in like a dog that had learned not to jump. The window plants leaned toward a sky that kept threatening rain. I set my bag down and took a long breath that scraped like a match. I opened the laptop and created a new parent folder on the clean side of my desktop. I named it Half Written. The words looked both temporary and proud. Inside it, I made 3 subfolders named Fragments, Scenes, and Spine. Naming creates gravity. That small architecture steadied me. I found an old email in my sent folder. It was the one I had written on a night we thought compromise was a synonym for love. In it, I had told Lucius the story will end as ours if we let it, and that the beginning belongs to whoever carries the first draft into the second, and that beginnings are rarely as pure as we want them to be. I copied a single sentence from that message into a new document and stared at it until it lost the face he had given it on that magazine cover. Words do not like being told who they belong to. I began to type in the voice I use when I am not trying to be fair. I wrote the exact fact of how it felt when the door closed in winter and the silence did not break. I wrote about the lie inside the joke in a hospital room scene and the way humor can be a trapdoor under remorse. I wrote about the danger of partnering with a person who thinks undoing you is a creative exercise. The paragraphs arrived like people at a vigil, some with candles and some with hot coffee. I let them stand where they wanted. My phone vibrated across the table. A new email had landed from an address I knew too well. No subject line, no greeting. 7 words that pretended to be casual. If there is an issue, let me know. He had attached nothing. He had offered nothing. It was a note written by a man who believes manners are sufficient currency in an economy of accountability. I pictured my reply as a blank page and liked it too much. I put the phone face down again and tapped the new document back to the front. Evening laid itself over the buildings along Milwaukee Avenue, and the sky found that bruised color that appears just before the streetlights confess. I wrote a short paragraph in present tense that said a person left mid-sentence and I would finish the paragraph without him. I did not frame it as a declaration. I framed it as a task, same as vacuuming or returning a library book. I copied that paragraph into the spine folder and felt the structure of something click in. Then came the wobble, the part of grief that tries on revenge because it looks like agency. I let my hands imagine the letter Oliver could write and the headlines that might follow. I let myself enjoy the small theater of a public correction. Then I watched the theater empty and saw myself alone on a stage sweeping confetti into a dustpan. The picture was clear. I closed my eyes until the music died. When I opened them, I reread the first page and made one revision that softened the edges without losing the truth. Margaret calls that moving from indictment to testimony. It is a discipline I trust. A storm rolled somewhere east and the apartment popped like a record. I made pasta and oversalted it and ate it anyway, because sometimes appetite is about finishing, not about pleasure. Before bed, I opened the half-written folder one more time to make sure nothing had disappeared. Everything sat where I had placed it. Fragments held little animals of thought that would need taming later. Scenes contained 2 rough rooms and a hallway between them. Spine held the sentence that would have to carry the weight. I clicked on Unfinished, the file that had kept me from falling the night he walked out, and I let it sit beside Half-Written in a polite, neighborly way. One was a witness, the other was a promise. I closed the laptop, I rinsed the dishes, I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a long, slow count. I pictured Lena's face when I would send her a photo of the page tomorrow. I pictured Margaret's nod when I brought her 3 printed paragraphs that knew their own names. I pictured Oliver's draft letter sleeping in his documents folder, with the date blank a safety net I might never step into. I went to the bedroom and lay on my side facing the window. The city hummed a tired lullaby, and a siren stitched itself east toward the lake. I felt the strangely clean quiet that arrives after a decision. I did not think about stealing or credit or legal phrases that separate ownership from occupation. I thought about a line I had finally written in a voice that did not flinch. I thought about how some thefts are loud and some are slow and polite, and how neither deserves the dignity of my days. Morning would come with coffee and commuter light and the indulgent mercy of a blank page. Tonight was for letting the last headline fade until the ink no longer stained my hands. I said the sentence to myself without any need to hear it echo. He left mid-sentence. I will finish the paragraph without him. Then I slept the sleep of someone who has given back what was never hers to carry. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 3. Rewriting the Ending. Morning arrived with the soft insistence of a cat pawing a door, and I sat at the small dining table with coffee and the file tree I had built. Half-written sounded like a dare when it was just a folder, so I bought a domain and watched the blank site blink back at me like a stage before the curtain. I kept the design simple dark text on clean white, no tricks, no banners. The first post was a paragraph I had written the night I decided to stop being an audience. It named a room after a departure and offered a sentence that stopped mid-stride. I invited whoever found it to nudge the sentence forward. I signed it with my first name and left everything else in the dark. By lunch, the post had a handful of notes, then a small scattering of comments that sounded like chairs scooting closer. A teacher in Ohio wrote about a promise that broke at a kitchen table. A nurse in Phoenix described a day she lost her singing voice after a goodbye. A woman in Duluth wrote only 2 words, and they were enough. Me too. I refreshed and watched the small counter turn like a slow water wheel. There was nothing strategic about it. It was a room, and I wanted the kind of quiet where people listen to each other breathe. I told Lena what I had done. She responded with a photo of her clapping at her desk in the office and a heart made out of paper clips. Margaret stopped by my door later and asked what had me grinning at a blank screen. I said I had built a place where a sentence could be rescued by strangers. She said there are worse religions. The second post arrived at midnight, 2 days later, when the city was in that silver hour that makes streetlights look kind. I wrote about an apology that never learned to walk. I asked readers to write where the apology might have gone if it had grown legs. The comments came slowly then in a rush. Someone in Atlanta wrote a paragraph that made my hands shake. Someone in Maine wrote a single line that hurt in a clean way. The site traffic map looked like a constellation. I went to sleep feeling watched over by people I would never meet. It kept going. Stories found each other. Posts built a spine. I made a category called Rooms and another one called Keys. Readers wrote endings that did not require forgiveness. Some wrote endings that did. I moderated comments with the same care I used at the office on messy manuscripts. Cruelty did not make it through the door. The site became a ritual. Mornings before work, a new prompt. Nights after dinner, a circle of replies. It felt less like leaving a mark than like helping others find the pencil. A week into the experiment, an email landed from a name that did not ring any bells. The subject asked for a quick conversation about the site. I Googled the sender, Noah Brooks Acquisitions at Beacon and Pine. He looked like a man who had learned how to sit in libraries without slouching. I wrote back and offered to meet at a place in the West Loop that lent out tables to people who needed the illusion of colleagues. He wrote that the space worked, and I should ask for the table near the window where the light is good for making decisions. He was waiting with a notebook and a soft tie that suggested he took notes like vows. He rose when I approached, and his smile did the kind of work that erases small social debts. He told me his team had found half-written through a column that mentioned it as a place where women finish what others left behind. He said he had spent his week reading and then rereading. He said the idea was simple and brave, and that brave simplicity is rarer than it should be. I told him this was not a calculated brand. It was me repairing a sentence. He said the best books start with a wound and a broom. Then he asked what I wanted half-written to become. I said I wanted it to keep feeling like a kitchen table that can stretch to seat as many as needed. He said Beacon and Pine likes to build tables. He asked if I had considered a collection. He said a curated set of posts and new work could hold a reader the way a hand holds a wrist. He said I should name it Half-Written Stories and that the title would do polite violence in a bookstore. He opened his notebook and showed me a blank page, which is a way some publishers display respect. He asked about legal noise. He asked if anyone had tried to claim ownership of anything I had posted. I told him I had a lawyer who could draft a sturdy consent note for contributors, and that the work would be clearly attributed, and that we would ask permission for any piece we wanted to include. I told him I did not want to build a platform that ate the voices it claimed to amplify. He nodded and said that ethics make for longevity and good sleep. We spoke for an hour like people who have waited a long time for the right conversation. When the server asked if we needed anything else, Noah leaned back and looked thoughtful in a way that did not feel rehearsed. He said he had one question that might be unfair. He said if the man who fractured the sentence reads this book, how will that feel? I held his gaze. I felt the little catch in my throat that used to be a leash. I said good. He will understand he was only a comma. Noah did not flinch. He wrote a small note in the margin and then said we should move forward if I was ready. I took the weekend to consider the shape of a contract and the shape of my days. On Sunday afternoon, I sat at my table with the curtains open. A heavy summer rain walked across the neighborhood like a line of symbols. I called Oliver to ask him to look at the draft agreement, and he said he liked most of what he saw. He suggested a clause that protected anonymous contributors if any later decided they wanted their pieces removed. He helped me with a royalties paragraph that did not penalize generosity. He was careful about agency. He knows my worst fear is being trapped in someone else's plan that has my name on the cover. On Monday, I met Noah again at the same table. He had redlined one sentence about marketing rights and left a question mark that felt like a handshake. We signed with pens that wrote too smoothly for signatures to feel real. His hand was steady. Mine surprised me by being steadier than my voice. He closed the folder and said he hoped the world was ready for a set of endings that refused the easy version of closure. I told him the world would take what it was given if you fed it slowly. The work of the book became its own weather. I spent nights selecting pieces and days writing bridges that taught them to speak to one another without losing their accents. Readers sent longer submissions after I posted guidelines. I wrote thank you notes that were longer than normal thank yous. Women sent paragraphs that had been trapped in phones for years. A woman in Bakersfield sent a page from a spiral notebook she used to keep in the glove compartment for when the silence in the car got heavy. A woman in Queens sent a voice memo that I transcribed with her permission and wept through twice because it had a rhythm prose, should not try to outsmart. I asked each writer what kind of credit they wanted. Some chose first names only, some chose initials. One chose no credit, but asked me to keep her comma as she had placed it. It was the same comma I always fight to keep. I took that as a blessing. Traffic lifted in a way we did not engineer. A columnist wrote that Half-Written functioned like a choir where every voice has a solo. A podcast asked me to talk about the difference between repair and revenge. I told them repair keeps you in your own house. Revenge moves you into someone else's. The host went quiet for a moment and then said he needed to write that down. He ended the episode early. The site crossed 100,000 visitors and then doubled. A reader in Flagstaff sent a photo of a sticky note on her bathroom mirror with one of the lines from the site written in neat teacher handwriting. I am not a sentence he gets to end. One evening in August, I stayed late at the co-working space. The big windows opened on a view of buildings pretending to be mountains. The room had the half-silence of people who genuinely like their work. I was drafting an introduction about how endings arrive without trumpets when my inbox pinged. No subject. The email was from an account that had been created that day. The body held a short critique of my last post in a rhythm I knew like my own walk. It ended with a suggestion. We could write the next part together like before. It was signed with 2 letters, L and M. I read it once, then again, and the shock was smaller than I expected. It felt like finding a shirt you used to love at the back of a drawer and seeing that it had stretched at the collar. I called Lena and put her on speaker. She listened as I read it to her in a voice I had trained to be flat. She said I could ignore it and it would starve. She said I could reply with a legal phrase and it would retreat. She asked what version of myself I wanted to feed. I wrote back with 3 sentences that took me 30 minutes. I thanked the sender for reading. I said the work had found its shape and did not require additional authorship. I ended simply, "This story no longer needs another author." I pressed send and watched the message go a small boat set loose in a canal. An hour later, a reply came that said he respected my choice and wished me well. No signature that could be printed and framed, no admission. Just the kind of politeness men use when they believe the sound of their restraint should count as grace. I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The air tasted like hot pennies and rain that could not figure out how to fall. I walked without destination until the city made room for my pace. Fall tucked itself into the corners. Beacon and Pine sent mock-ups of a cover warm cream with a thin title and a small quiet period that I asked to be moved 1 millimeter to the left. Noah sent line edits that behaved like a good dance partner. He kept asking if I was eating, and I kept pretending I was. He came to a reading of new work at a small shop in Logan Square and sat in the second row with the posture of a person who knows how to let a woman have her stage. After he told me my voice did a thing on the words that needed to be heard by people who liked their endings clean, I said they were about to be disappointed. We laughed, and the laugh did not hide anything. December brought an article that called the site a minor miracle in an era that rewards shouting. Margaret sent me a screenshot with 3 clapping hands, which is as emotional as she gets over text. Oliver checked in to say the letter we had not sent could be deleted whenever I was ready. I told him to keep it sleeping a while longer. Sleeping things have their own jobs. At the end of the year, we scheduled the announcement. Beacon and Pine would release half-written stories in late winter. I wrote a post on the site that thanked readers for their endings and asked permission to include a handful with credit or with careful anonymity. The comments filled with yes and stories about mothers and lists of firsts. The traffic heat map looked like holiday lights. On New Year's Eve, I stayed home and let the city ring itself silly without me. I printed the table of contents and taped it to the wall above my desk. I could see the arc like a bridge built out of small, steady hands. I made tea and walked to the window. Fireworks tried to draw flowers in the sky and mostly failed. I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt correctly placed inside my own life. In January, the site crossed 1 million visits. People wrote to say their therapists had given them prompts from the blog in sessions where language had to be coaxed out like a shy animal. A librarian in Spokane asked for a reading guide for book clubs that did not want to talk about wine. Noah sent a final schedule. He said the bookstore in New York had a room for us in March, and another room had said yes in Chicago the following week. He asked if I was ready. I said readiness is a myth we invented to avoid joy. He laughed and said he would put that on a tote bag. I closed the email and stared at the calendar. I watched the dates sit there like small doors. I printed the pages that needed my last touch and set them beside a thin stack of notes in other people's handwriting. The room was quiet in the way rooms are when they hold their breath for good news. I picked up my pen and leaned in. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 4. The reading he didn't expect. Backstage smelled like old paper and lemon oil, and the marble outside the curtain held the soft roar of a crowd that had already made its choice to listen. Noah stood at my shoulder with a program folded into a thin wand. He did that when he was trying not to show nerves. I held my marked copy of half-written stories and tried the first line in my mouth to make sure it still fit. A staffer in a navy blazer peeked in and lifted 2 fingers. 2 minutes. Noah leaned in and kept his voice low so the room would not steal it. You know the room is yours, right? I know the room belongs to whoever breathes second. Then be second and first at the same time. I smiled because that kind of gentle nonsense means devotion. I touched the cover once and stepped into the light. The New York Public Library Hall always makes me feel like a child in a cathedral where the gods are made of sentences. The ceiling lifted above us like a held breath. Rows of faces tilted up. A hush drifted down even before I reached the lectern. I adjusted the mic with the care you give fragile things you still need to use. Then I began the piece titled, "For Those Left," mid-sentence. I read slowly, letting the commas do their small moral work. A woman in the 3rd row pressed a tissue to her mouth. A man in the back nodded as if he were keeping time. I felt the room lean toward me the way a friend leans across a table when you finally say the precise name of your hurt. When I reached the final paragraph, I let quiet have its turn. The last line arrived and did not ask for applause. It asked for recognition. The quiet broke into a sound that felt like fabric tearing and then mending. I closed the book and stepped aside while the moderator thanked the library and the people who keep its lights tender. We moved to the signing table in a side alcove with soft sconces and a view of rain polishing the stone steps outside. The line wound like a careful ribbon. Hands placed books on the table with a reverence I will never learn to deserve. The first woman whispered that she had left a sentence 2 years ago and only finished it last week. The next said her daughter had posted on the site and that it had changed the shape of their house. I signed names with a steady pen. I wrote small sentences when people asked, one to a teacher in Queens, keep what you know in the room, one to a nurse who worked nights, let the morning be patient. I had signed 15 books when the air shifted. It was not louder, it was colder. People know when a character enters before he says a word. I looked up, and he was there, the memory that had learned to walk into daylight, Lucas Merritt. The black suit tried to impersonate humility and failed. He held my book like a prop that could be used as a weapon or a shield, depending on the line reading. He stepped forward, and the first thing I noticed was that he was thinner. The second was that his eyes had learned how to look like he regretted the right things. A phone camera lifted somewhere to my left, then another. He placed the book on the table. His voice traveled exactly far enough. You used our story. The line was practiced soft at the edges. It begged for an echo. I kept my face level and let my hands rest on the table, as if it were any other page in need of a calm pen. No, I finished it. You just walked away. A small intake of breath moved through the people nearest us, the kind of sound that happens when a glass does not shatter after all. He shifted as if to say more. A young reporter in a camel coat with a notebook held like a passport appeared at my right elbow. Later, I would learn her name was Chloe Reed. In that moment, I registered only her stillness and the way she left room for the words to arrive without shoving them. Lucas pinched the bridge of his nose as if we were both being unreasonable. He turned a fraction so his profile would be kind to any camera lucky enough to catch it. I always plan to acknowledge your help. Help is what you offer a stranger at a gas station. What we did had a different name. A murmur, then the shuffle of security at the far end of the line, then the patient hand of the moderator, who understood a scene when she saw one. She did not interfere. She let the room learn. Chloe lifted her phone and did not hide it. Her voice was neutral in the way that would allow readers to fill in their own weather later. Would you like to add anything on the record? Lucas turned to her quickly, then gentled his tone. I am proud of the work Adrienne and I did in the early days. I am proud of what she has built. I wish the narrative allowed for nuance. There is room for nuance, I said. There is also room for a sentence you cannot take credit for. He smiled, a small white flag pretending to be silk. No hard feelings. I did not give him the performance of forgiveness. I slid the book back toward him unsignatured. The line behind him shifted its weight and then held very still. He picked up the book and lifted his chin as if to smell the air for sympathy. Then he took a half step back and let himself be absorbed by the crowd. Chloe set her phone on the table and met my eyes with the wicked kindness of a woman who has had to survive 100 small erasures. Thank you for letting that breathe. You might want the dates, I said. I will want everything, she said. She asked for the interview link everyone had read last year, and I wrote the site on the corner of her notes. She asked when the earliest draft carrying the specific phrasing had been created. I told her the month and the night and the city. She asked if I wanted to say anything about legal action. I told her I had chosen a door that did not lead to court. She nodded like a person who understands that silence is sometimes a castle and not a wound. The signing line found its pulse again. I wrote names and short sentences, and once the simple word yes when a woman asked if it counted, that she had finally stopped waiting for an apology from a man who could not pronounce apology without swallowing the O. By the time we wrapped, the lamps had turned the hall into honey, and the crowd had thinned to crew and lingering admirers of architecture. Noah gathered the pens in the last program and touched my shoulder. You handled that in a way that makes me want to break a chair and also bake a cake. I vote for cake. He smiled, and then his phone buzzed like a bee that had found a specific flower. He glanced at the screen and his eyebrows climbed. He turned the display so I could see. Chloe had already posted a short clip with a caption that was nothing but the barest facts. A woman reading at the library, a man saying a line that wanted to be a claim, a reply that made the claims smaller. The views spun like a dial on a ride you would be wise to exit. We walked out into the vestibule where the echo is friendlier. Rain pressed itself against the glass like a visitor without a coat. As we reached the steps, a trio of students asked for a quick comment. They held a tiny microphone as if it were a fragile animal. The tallest one cleared his throat and tried to keep his voice from cracking. How do you feel about what happened in there? I read the paragraph I wrote. That is all I came to do. The tallest one smiled as if he had passed a test he had not studied for. On the ride back to the hotel, my phone began to click and purr with notifications. Chloe had published her piece an hour after the event. The headline sat with remarkable poise, "The Woman Who Finished His Story." Inside, she laid out the timeline without tipsy drama. She linked to the archived interview and placed a paragraph from my early blog post beside a paragraph from his promotional materials. Near match, not a smoking gun. More like a familiar footprint in soft dirt. The comments did the rest. Readers made supercuts and nested images. They added receipts older than some romances. Noah kept glancing between the windshield and my face as if I might break at a seam he could not see. You do not owe anyone a performance tonight. Turn the phone off. I am not performing. I am witnessing. Back in my room, I put the phone on the desk and watched the screen bloom. A trending tag rose like a kite, half-written truths. The first 100 posts were quiet and precise. Women quoting their favorite lines from the site and placing them beside book lines that tasted familiar. Men talking in low, careful voices about credit they had once taken and how the admission felt like a good kind of fever. Then came the noise. It always comes. I closed the app and walked to the window. New York glimmered like a promise someone actually kept. Noah texted from the lobby. Cake has been acquired. I opened the door to him and to a small box that smelled like almond and ambition. He set it on the coffee table and flicked the paper back like a magician who knows the trick is not the important part. They will ask you to go on a morning show. I will say no. They will ask you to sit on a panel about intellectual property. I will say no to that too. He leaned back in the chair and studied the ceiling pattern like a puzzle he could solve if he blinked in the right rhythm. Your restraint is going to make them angrier than any speech would. I know. He nodded. He knew, too. The next morning, the angle of the coverage sharpened. A publishing trade reported that Lucas's imprint had placed a hold on shipment of his paperback reprint pending review. The word review did the work of 3 stronger words without getting anyone sued. A bookstore in Brooklyn posted a handwritten sign next to my book that read, "Small endings, big exits, choose wisely." The clip Chloe had posted grew teeth. Editors who had once called me to fix their messes called to ask if I wanted to comment. I declined with a sentence that did not try to be clever. I have said what I needed to say in the work. At noon, a reporter with careful hair stepped in front of me on the library steps, where I had returned to sign a few extra copies they had ordered after last night. He held out a mic and did not wait to be invited. Ms. Hale, do you feel vindicated? I let the rain touch my face for a beat, and then I answered. I felt finished last year. Tonight I just read my part. The reporter opened his mouth for a follow-up, and then thought better of it. He lowered the mic a fraction and stepped aside. A woman who had been watching from under a green umbrella let out a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I could not tell. It did not matter. She raised the umbrella and walked away with a purpose I recognized. The library staff thanked me with a warmth that did not require any reciprocation. They pressed a tote into my hands with a drawing of a lion reading on it. I told them it made my day, which was true. Noah held the door, and we stepped into the wet afternoon that smelled like newsprint and pennies. Taxis hissed by, and pedestrians negotiated puddles with the grace of people who have made friends with rain. I stood at the top of the steps and let the city blur. A girl in a yellow coat took a photo with her phone of nothing in particular and seemed pleased. A bicycle bell chirped twice. Somewhere behind us, a page turned in a book too large to carry. I felt an old muscle unclench, not in triumph but in relief. To watch the narrative detach from me and walk on its own legs felt like handing a grown child a set of keys and trusting the road. Noah offered the umbrella. I shook my head and let the water find my hairline. He laughed, then surrendered and closed it. Where to now? Nowhere loud. We went down the steps slowly, not because the stone was slick, though it was, but because the pace felt correct. At the curb, a cab braked and a splash jeweled my shoes. I did not care. The sky had the color of a soft bruise healing. I turned once and looked back at the doorway and the shadowed lions beyond the glass. Then I faced the street again and stepped forward as if the day had been waiting for me to choose. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. The Story Without Him. Morning in Maine wears a soft coat. Fog pressed its face to the cabin windows, and the pines along the bluff stood like tall listeners. I had been here a week by then, long enough for my phone to learn that signal was optional, long enough for my shoulders to relearn a shape that did not include armor. My mother had left early to open the bookstore in town. She had stocked a little display near the door with my book and a hand-lettered card that said finished and still finishing. She refused to let me sign copies in front of customers. She said anonymity was a comfort that fame cannot afford. I loved her for that sentence. The house crackled with the busy silence of old wood. I set the kettle on and stood at the small table that faced the water. The ocean was gray silk. Gulls stitched it with white thread. On the wall above the table, I had taped a single printed line that Lucas once wrote and never learned how to own. It was the sentence that used to hold me like a lock. Now it looked like punctuation, a comma with too much pride. I felt tenderness for it the way you do for shirts that no longer fit. I opened a stack of mail my mother had left by the fruit bowl. Bills addressed to the cabin. A postcard from a cousin I forget to text back. A letter in a neat hand on cream paper with a return address from Ohio. I sat and slid a knife under the flap. The first line made my lungs step back. Thank you for finishing the story I could not finish. The writer told me about evenings spent at her kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and a browser open to half-written. She told me she had not known how to speak to her daughters about the day their father left. She told me she had borrowed 3 sentences from the site to begin. She said her daughters had added an ending that was kinder than she believed she deserved. She said the girls taped it to the refrigerator so they would stop telling the house the wrong story. She signed her name only with a first letter. I read it twice. I pressed the page flat as if to iron away the miles. My phone found a bar of service and buzzed across the table like a stubborn bee. Noah had left a voicemail. I called back while the kettle huffed and clicked. He answered on the second ring with the kind of hello that sounded like a grin. Columbia said yes, he said without ceremony. The creative writing program is placing half-written stories on the spring syllabus, a seminar on repair and narrative ethics. They want you to visit. They want the room to hear how a paragraph can be a form of mercy. I let the steam blur my glasses. For a long breath, I had no word that felt adequate. Then I told him I could come if I was allowed to sit in a circle rather than stand in front. He laughed and said the room would be arranged however I needed it. He asked about the ocean. I told him it had the color of a kept promise. He asked if I was sleeping. I told him yes. He said then I was doing the work. We let the conversation slow until it found its own punctuation. He said he would email me dates and that I should ignore them until morning. He said a break is only a break if you do not schedule it to death. I told him I was putting the phone back on the table and walking away for an hour. He said good. He said make the hour heavy with nothing. After tea, I took the path down the bluff. The sand was firm with cold and mist salted my hair. I walked far enough that the cabin became a square of softer gray among darker trees. I thought about the women who had written to the site and the way their voices braided into something like a rope you could hold when the wind forgot your name. I thought about the letter from Ohio and the refrigerator door wearing its new story like a medal. I thought about my father. On a shelf in the cabin, there is a photo of him at a picnic table with a book in his hands and his head thrown back. He had the kind of laugh you feel in the ribs of the person standing next to you. He taught 9th grade English for 30 years and swore that commas were the kindest invention of the human mind. He used to say endings belong to the person brave enough to write them. When he got sick, he asked my mother to read to him from a battered novel that had made them fall in love. She stopped at a page where the paragraph ended mid-thought. He had said, leave it there. He had said the heart knows how to finish what the mouth cannot. He died the winter I moved to Chicago. His absence is a room I visit, not a room I live in. Back at the cabin, a small box sat on the porch table where there had been nothing before. It was the size of a loaf of bread and wore a postal label with my name spelled correctly. No return address. My stomach understood before my eyes did. I brought it inside and set it on the table beneath the taped line on the wall. I ran the knife along the tape and lifted the lid. Inside lay a neatly tied manuscript, plain paper band, no title page, no cover letter. On top, a single sheet with 3 sentences in a hand I used to read like a weather report. You finished it better than I ever could. I am sorry for what the work cost you. Thank you for teaching me how to stop performing. There was no name. There did not need to be. I stood for a long moment listening to my own breath. Then I slid the paper back under the band and closed the lid. I did not unfold the pages. I had learned to protect the weather inside my house. I carried the box to the bookshelf and set it beside the framed photo of my father. My palm rested on the frame. I told the empty room that the ending was mine to write. I did not say it like triumph. I said it like a vow. My mother came in on a gust of cold and pine sap. She hung her scarf on the chair and asked if I wanted chowder from the place near the harbor. I said yes, because grief and joy both require soup. She noticed the box and raised an eyebrow. I told her what it contained in 3 sentences without using a single dramatic verb. She nodded once. She said not every door needs to be opened. Then she put water on for tea and asked if I was walking with her to the shore after lunch. I said of course. News travels in circles I do not care to map. A day later, my phone lit up with a note from Oliver. He had copied an announcement from a trade publication. The imprint that had backed Lucas for 3 years was dissolving their contract with him for unspecified ethical concerns. The article was quiet and clean and did not salute its own correctness. It did not mention my name. It did not need to. I stared at the headline until it lost its shine. Then I texted Oliver a single thank you for the care he had shown the sleeping letter we never had to send. He replied with a small sentence that looked like a shrug. Sometimes the work is letting time do its own job. That night, the wind moved through the trees with the soft insistence of a late visitor, and the house answered in small creaks that meant nothing and everything. I sat at the table with a legal pad and wrote a list in pencil. It was not a bucket list or a set of resolutions. It was a set of questions I wanted my next book to earn its way through. What does repair look like when no apology arrives? How do you teach a sentence to carry weight without breaking? Where do you place kindness when it has nowhere to sit? I wrote until the page filled like sand with footsteps. Days found a rhythm, morning tea, letters from readers that I answered slowly, walks with my mother along the harbor where boats rested on their names, calls with Noah that were mostly about weather and bread and sometimes about margins and paperweight. Once he told me an instructor at Columbia had cried while reading a chapter I wrote about refrigerator doors. He said the class had sat in silence for 3 whole minutes after the last page. He said one student had asked if silence could be graded. I told him to tell the student yes. On a Thursday full of clear light, I took the printed line off the wall. The tape gave a small sigh. I folded the paper twice and placed it in a drawer with spare batteries and a compass that no longer points anywhere helpful. The space above the table looked larger. I took down the corkboard that had held clippings and notes from the last year and leaned it against the wall. Then I opened my laptop. The screen blinked awake and held my face for a beat like a friend remembering your birthday. A file sat on the desktop waiting like a well-behaved dog, unfinished. I opened it. The first paragraph rose to meet me. It felt honest and a little young. I let it stand. Next to it, the folder half-written waited with its quiet spine and its crowded rooms. I clicked away. I opened a new document and watched the cursor blink. I typed a title without ceremony, the story without him. The words arranged themselves with the simple dignity of a clean table. The first sentence arrived walking instead of running. It spoke about a kitchen window and a winter sky and a person learning to stop auditioning for someone else's forgiveness. It was enough. I wrote until the light shifted from white to the gold that makes old pine floors look like they applaud. My mother knocked and entered with wool hats and 2 apples. We ate them over the sink the way people do when they love each other and also love being practical. She asked what the new one would be about. I said it would be about what happens after you stop performing. She nodded as if the answer had been hiding in the room, and I had finally pointed to it. As twilight folded itself into the corners, I walked the path to the bluff one more time. The water below breathed the ancient rhythm that forgives all schedules. I thought about the women who had sent me their endings, and how my book had only made a place for them to set those endings down without apology. I thought about Lucas and the quiet that had settled where his show used to be. There was no joy in his loss. There was only the rightness of the ledger balancing itself. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and listened to the old arguments in my head find their coats and leave. Closure is not something anyone can hand you. It is a room you build out of sentences that speak to each other without raising their voices. It is the moment your body understands that you are no longer an audience to someone else's story about you. On the walk back, I shaped the final lines I would say when people asked what happened next. They would lean in for the gossip, and I would give them a paragraph about work. They would ask if I felt vindicated, and I would tell them about a kitchen table in Ohio and a refrigerator wearing a medal. I would tell them that writing it down was how we kept from letting the wrong story win. Inside the cabin had gathered its evening self. Lamps hummed. The kettle made its shy little song. I opened the laptop again and placed the new file beside the old ones, the story without him. I rested my fingers on the keys and looked once more at the photograph of my father. His laugh had paused in that picture like a comma. He would like this ending. He would tell me to leave it here. If a person leaves you mid-sentence, do not wait in the doorway to hear them explain the weather. Pick up your own pen, walk to your own table, finish the part they dropped. When you do, you are not only closing a chapter, you are opening a door you will be proud to walk through. If any part of my story helped you cross your own threshold, stay with me a while. Tell me the lines you reclaimed. Leave your ending on the table so someone behind you will find it and keep walking. I watched the screen soften as the cursor waited. Then I began to type, and the small sound of keys filled the room like rain that finally recognized the roof above it.